And I know you touched on it that, comics were a bit of an influence for you growing up, as they were for me, and I think they were for a lot of people. But I think the difference for, especially between American comics and English/European comics, which I'm interested in, was here, and as I'm sure everything is Marvel DC. Yeah, Image came along in the 90s, and there were small independent presses that were here and there. But whenever I heard about European comics, I would always hear about Heavy Metal and 2000 AD and Judge Dredd and what Alan Moore was doing. And then when Neil Gaiman came along, and all the guys that were there in that same time frame, mid 70s to early to mid 80s, how much were you absorbing from that as well as American comics as a kid?
I was mostly absorbing from that. I actually absorbed very little from American comics until I was in my sort of mid to late teens. I mean, it's funny that you mention Alan and Neil, because the great body of their work was done for the American market, not the British market. Alan had a prior career mostly working for 2000 AD, but also
Mhm.
anthology comics like Warrior and stuff, where he created Marvel Man, and had a sort of had success there and had that career. But then he quickly moved to America, where the opportunities were much greater. The money was a lot better as well. Let's be frank,
I'm sure.
because British comics at that time really did not pay a lot at all. Where he got the chance to do things like, his epic run on Swamp Thing, which led to Watchmen and so on. Neil actually did very little in the British comic scene. I think he had maybe 2 short stories in 2000 AD, and that was about it. Oh, and then he also, sorry, he completed Alan's run on Marvel Man. He did, I think, was it book 3 of Marvel Man, and then immediately, well, almost immediately, it felt like, moved to America and
Mhm.
started doing stuff like Black Orchid, which led to Sandman at Vertigo, well, and the creation of Vertigo. Um, and but part of that came with those guys because they did grow up reading American comics. They wanted to go and work for the big American publishers. I didn't. I grew up reading 2000 AD, and horror comic Scream we had over here was a great favorite of mine, and war titles like Action and Warlord and Victor and stuff. Those were my influences, along with the books that I
Mhm.
was reading. Um, which were also a lot of war books at the time, actually, when I was a young boy. Lots of sci-fi and war. I was a young boy, what can you expect?
Right.
And so yeah, those were my influences. But then, in the great irony, I have never worked in the British comics market. Never,
Right.
not once. All of my comics work has been either for occasionally British book publishers putting out graphic novels, or in terms of, sort of what we might call pure comics, has been for the American market, including a lot of those independent publishers that you mentioned. That's where I started with people like Oni Press, later Image, and so on. I've actually done very little work for. The only work I ever did for DC was a couple of commissioned scripts that I got paid for, but they were never published. They were kind of, filed away. Um, and then I did a couple of years working for Marvel on Daredevil and associated titles around the time of the Shadowland event. But other than that, all of my work has been for the American indie market, if you include Image as an indie, obviously. And
Mhm.
yeah, none for the British market at all. So this is yet another reason why I'm a little unusual in the field. I just haven't followed the same kind of path as pretty much anybody else that I know. And part of that is because I didn't grow up reading superheroes. So I have no nostalgic love for them. I have nothing against them. And I had fun in those couple of years that I worked for Marvel. It was fun doing what I got to do, which were the very sort of street level noirish heroes. That's, that appeals to me. But I don't have, as I say, that nostalgic affection. I've never been, I'm not one of these people who goes, I have my Batman story in my head that I want to write one day. I don't. I just don't. And I don't have a Spider-Man story that I want to write someday. And there are many, many other creators out there who do, who absolutely, that's their aim. They want to write that ideal Spider-Man story or whatever that they've had in their head since they were 6 years old. And so I just kind of quietly stepped away from that field. There were people who wanted those jobs far more than I did,
Mhm.
and frankly would probably do a much better job than I would because of that love that they have for the characters. And so I was like, you know what, you go for it. I'm just, you know, that's it's not really my thing. I had fun doing it, but it's not my world. And you know, let other people in who want it more than me, and like I say, will probably do a better job. But it is, yeah, I've had a strange career path. I don't think anybody else has had quite the same path that I have, and I'm sure it's because of this strange mix of influences that I've had growing up that have affected how I approach my career and the sort of things that I like to write.
Yeah, and also that was part of the reason why, of the many reasons why I was interested to talk to you. I mean, I know you and I have kind of passed each other in the periphery doing other things on other platforms, but what interests me about you is that you didn't take the more traveled road, that you have kind of gone this back way, but still managed to come up with a successful career as a writer and a content creator and a producer across multiple mediums. But what I'm interested in also is, because I think we all get to this point, and I certainly did as a budding hack writer of some very small repute myself, of thinking, can you think back to when you were a kid, and if it was like a movie or a TV show or a book where you first got that inkling of, I could do something better than this, or this is something that I could still do? Did you have kind of that flashpoint?
If I did, it's certainly the second. You know, if it was a kind of, oh, I would like to do this as well, it would have been very, very early, because I've been reading books and comics, you know, since a very, very young age. You know, frankly, I don't remember a lot of those years. I mean, I've often mentioned this. One of my earliest memories is when I was 4 years old. My father read a copy of the Beano to me, which is a British children's anthology comic. And I distinctly remember sitting on his lap. I couldn't read, but he was reading it to me. Um, and then, as I say, growing up, I carried on reading comics. I was a voracious reader of novels as well, and read a little nonfiction. So I always had. I can't remember exactly when I had the feeling that that would be fun to do. I've always made up my own stories, and I'm sure that's because of being exposed to them so much at such a young age. As for, I think I can do this better, I'm not sure I've ever had that in comics or novels, at any rate. Where I did have it, mainly because, you know, I just kind of, because I've read I've read good stuff, and so I read it, and I normally have the opposite reaction. I read something good and I go, oh, I'm never going to be this good, why am I even bothering? Which I know is a very common, you know, common
Guilty.
thing, yeah, amongst, you know, pretty much every creator has that. But where I didn't, the one time that I distinctly remember experiencing a story and thinking I could do better than this, is in video games.
Mm.
And that was the first two Silent Hill games.
Oh, really?
I'd played video games pretty much my whole life. I mean, I grew up in the era of when computer games and home computers came about. You know, I'm old enough to remember a time before home personal computers. And
Right.
so I grew up with arcade machines and personal computers and that very early era. So I've always played games, always enjoyed them. It was a Lucasfilm's game, LucasArts, it would have been, sorry, a game called Loom, which I've
Hmm.
talked about on other podcasts before, that inspired me to want to write games, because that was the first game I encountered that really had a genuinely moving story. And I mean, you play it now and it's a bit primitive, but at the time, and certainly as I was quite young at the time as well, it felt like a step change. It felt like a quantum leap in game narrative for me. But it was, yeah, playing the first two Silent Hill games on PlayStation, where was the first real time that I felt I really enjoyed that, but I think I actually could do that and could do it better in some ways. Um, Now, since then, I have written many video games. I got into the industry and I have a lot more sympathy with those creators of those early games than I did when I was a young man when I played them. I look back now and I think, oh, actually, I can see all the limitations they were working with, and I
Right.
understand why it was so primitive, and, you know, all the problems that they would have had and limitations they would have had. Nevertheless, So I'm saying this so that I don't get horrible, angry email from people who love those games, because I love them as well. I genuinely do.
Mhm.
But the dialogue and voice acting in them is not the best. It could be a lot better. But like I say, I understand now the problems and restrictions that they were working under. Nevertheless, it was enough to make me think, that's an area that I could probably do quite well in. Maybe I could make an impact. And it was many years later, actually. I say many years. I mean, that's not true. It felt like many years because it was early in my career. Now that I think about it, it was actually only about 4 or 5 years later when I did then write my first video game.
Mhm.
And as I say, I've written them ever since. That was in 2006. I've written them ever since, and it is actually it's a lot more difficult than people realize, than I realized when I got into it. But that was the impetus that got me along that road. And I'm happy to say that, even though, as I say, I feel a little bit ashamed now that I was so dismissive of that earlier work, on the other hand, I'm kind of proud to say that I have had an impact. I know there are things I have done that have improved the lot of game writers overall in small ways, not least of which I sit on the video games committee of the Writers Guild of Great Britain. And one of the things we do is draw up guidelines for narrative workers in games and stuff, but also just things I've done as a games writer. I know there are things I've done, practices that I have helped institute and solidify that have improved game narratives. So at least I made good on my somewhat naive perhaps but well-meaning promise.
Hey guys, Devin here. Thanks for watching. Be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and check out the links below for more great original content. Talk to you soon. Bye.